The night settled over Europe like a vast shroud of iron, its silence humming with the unspoken terror of a continent strangled by war. And somewhere inside that crushing darkness, a single woman bent over a slip of paper that would one day ripple out into the saving of thousands who would never know her name. Her world was small when compared to the monstrous machinery of the conflict surrounding her, a dimly lit room littered with code sheets, worn pencils, and the fractured hopes of those who worked tirelessly to break open the secrets the enemy buried beneath layers of arrogance and encrypted certainty. Yet within that smallness existed an intensity powerful enough to alter the trajectory of lives positioned far beyond her reach. She was neither soldier nor commander, nor any figure whose presence demanded the weight of authority. She was simply a mathematician, quiet in demeanor but volcanic in thought. And on that particular evening, her mind churned with a stubborn insistence that the enemy's perfection could not possibly be perfect. There had to be a flaw. There was always a flaw. And as she folded a sheet of paper in what her colleagues might have dismissed as a trivial, even foolish gesture, a sliver of revelation penetrated through the monotony of endless failures. The air in the room trembled with exhaustion, every ticking second gnawing at morale while outside the war advanced like a tide of steel across fields, already soaked with the memories of those who had fallen. She could hear distant boots in her imagination, the thunder of artillery, the crack of aircraft slicing through night, and she felt the pressure of all that destruction funneling down into the candlelit space in which she worked, as if the war itself leaned over her shoulder demanding answers. She ran her fingers along the crease she had just made on the paper, the fold neat yet somehow radical in its simplicity. She stared at it as if the universe had tucked a whisper into its geometry. The Nazis prided themselves on the invincible complexity of their encrypted communications, a fortress of logic and machinery spun from gears, rotors, and delusions of superiority. But paper did not care for superiority. Paper did not bow to power. Paper yielded only to observation, to intuition, to the stubbornness of a mind willing to reconsider the obvious. Her pulse quickened as new possibility took shape within her thoughts, a shape that spiraled outward like a lantern in a mine shaft, revealing potential pathways obscured until now. She considered the turn of rotors, the repetition hiding somewhere beneath the mechanical noise, the faint irregularities that only human intuition could detect. If the smallest flaw existed, her fold had just shown her the angle from which it could be seen. She pictured the men whose fates dangled invisibly over the abyss, 3,400 soldiers preparing for movements they believed secret, unaware that the enemy was listening, calculating, anticipating. If she failed tonight, if her hunch dissolved into nothing by sunrise, then those men might march into slaughter without ever knowing that somewhere, someone had tried desperately to protect them with nothing but graphite, thought, and a sheet of paper. The lamps hissed as she leaned closer, her breath shallow as she tried again to recreate the pattern she believed she saw, letting intuition lead her fingers. She folded, unfolded, compared, adjusted, the paper slowly softening along lines that matched the cryptic rhythms she had studied for months. The repetition grew clearer, a pulse beneath the surface. She felt as though she were listening to the enemy breathe. The room seemed to shrink around her as her focus narrowed until even time itself seemed to pause, afraid to interrupt. She traced symbols, mapped shifts, pressed her palms flat against the table to steady herself as the realization took form that this simple, nearly ridiculous folding technique might be the key to collapsing the enemy's overconfidence. They had built their fortress tall, but within its walls they had overlooked the grain of sand that, when pushed at just the right angle, could trigger an avalanche. Her throat tightened as she imagined the faces of men in muddy trenches, the letters tucked in their pocket, the unspoken prayers they held close in the... They were unaware that their lives teetered on the edge of a discovery miles away, in a quiet room where no guns roared and no medals. She worked not for glory but for breath itself, for the chance that those soldiers might take one more, then another, and return home someday with stories that did not end in the abrupt silence of death. She pressed the fold one last time, and in that motion, the pattern clicked fully, a soft but seismic shift that echoed like distant thunder within her mind. She knew, with the clarity of lightning, that she had found an entry point into the enemy's secrets. And with that knowledge came the first fragile glimmer of hope that an entire operation might be rescued from catastrophe. If you're watching this part 1, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, so we can continue this journey together. The next morning arrived like a blade drawn through fog, sharp and sudden. The war did not rest, and neither did the mind that had spent the night wrestling with the impossible. The woman's name, Eleanor Price, had already begun to fade beneath the weight of official reports and military designations. Yet at that hour, her discovery burned brighter than the lamps that lined the narrow halls of the intelligence. She clutched the folded paper to her chest, its edges creased and softened by endless handling, as though it were both shield and weapon. When she reached the room where the code team were, the sound of machines and typewriters created a symphony of urgency, each keystroke echoing the heartbeat of a world at war. Her colleagues were exhausted spectres of themselves, faces pale beneath the fluorescent buzz, eyes rimmed in sleepless calculation. They were fighting an invisible enemy, one of mathematics, logic, and mechanical arrogance. And now Eleanor had brought with her something so simple it bordered on absurdity, a paper fold that might bring the entire Nazi communication web crashing down. She laid it on the table. For a moment no one spoke. The hum of the room seemed to falter, suspended between skepticism and curiosity. A senior officer, a man who had once dismissed her as the quiet one with the messy desk, leaned closer, frowning. "A fold," he said, his tone a blend of disbelief and weariness. "We're surrounded by rotors, circuits, and cryptographic machines, and you bring us a fold." But Eleanor did not flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on the crease, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of conviction. She began to explain, her voice low but urgent, outlining the rhythm she had uncovered, the hidden repetition that revealed itself only when the patterns were aligned through her fold. She spoke not as one defending an idea, but as one revealing a truth that had always been there, waiting to be seen. Gradually, the room leaned in. The officer's skepticism softened into cautious attention. Another analyst adjusted his spectacles and began testing her theory on the intercepted messages sprawled across the table. The air shifted. Something electric pulsed between them as the first signs of validation emerged. Letters, numbers, sequences aligning where before there had been chaos. The impossible began to fracture. For months, they had stared at these same strings of code, their meanings buried beneath the mechanical genius of enigma-like precision. But now, through a human hand and a single paper fold, cracks appeared in the wall of the enemy's invincibility. Eleanor stood motionless as the realization spread, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would betray her calm. What they saw was no longer just coincidence. It was a pattern, a door opening. Within hours, confirmation spread across the building like fire. The messages were not random. There was a flaw in the system. By exploiting the rhythmic error she had revealed, the team could begin predicting the movement of Nazi convoys, decoding their orders before they reached their destinations. It was not full victory, not yet, but it was enough to intercept the transmission that would have led to the ambush of 3,400 Allied troops advancing through northern France. Eleanor's fold, once dismissed as foolish, had become a lifeline stretching invisibly across the continent. Men would march through smoke and ruin, never knowing that their lives had been preserved by a crease in paper, by an idea born in quiet defiance of logic's rigidity. That evening, the officers met in the command room, their faces lit by maps glowing with red and blue markers. Eleanor stood near the back, half forgotten now that the discovery was in motion, her hands clasped tightly as she watched others translate her insight into strategy. Pride mingled with sorrow in her chest, for she knew how fleeting recognition could be in wartime. History was written by generals, not by women hunched over desks. But as orders were dispatched, and as the radio crackled with the first reports of troop withdrawals from areas now known to be compromised, she allowed herself a single breath of relief. Her fold had worked. Her foolishness had become salvation. She returned to her small room that night, the paper still on her desk, edges worn, now sacred. The war continued to roar beyond her walls, but inside there was a stillness that bordered on the divine. She thought of the soldiers, of mothers and lovers waiting across oceans, of the fragile thread connecting them all. She thought, too, of how something as fragile as paper could reshape the outcome of a battle. The room filled again with the hum of possibility, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe in something resembling hope. If you're still with us after part 2, take a moment to subscribe. It helps bring stories like Eleanor's to life and keeps this history breathing. War, by its very nature, devours names. It turns the living into statistics, courage into footnotes, and miracles into foot soldiers, for history's indifferent. Yet somewhere between the static of intercepted signals and the unending churn of military reports, Eleanor Price's discovery began to echo through the labyrinth of Allied command. It wasn't shouted from podiums or printed in newspapers. It travelled in murmurs, in the tight exchanges of officers who understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. The paper fold had cracked open, not only a message, but a vulnerability the Nazis believed impossible. For the first time in months, Allied intelligence could anticipate rather than react. The invisible chessboard of Europe shifted by a single silent move from a woman who, in the eyes of those above her, was never meant to play. The orders that followed were swift and confidential. The intercepted message, decoded through Eleanor's method, revealed precise coordinates of a German ambush planned along a crucial supply route where 3,400 Allied troops were expected to advance within 48 hours. The enemy, confident in their encrypted superiority, had detailed the timing, the artillery placements, even the expected point of retreat for the survivors, if there would be any. Without Eleanor's intervention, the convoy would have driven straight into a meticulously constructed slaughter. Instead, her discovery allowed command to reroute the troops under the cover of darkness, maneuvering them through terrain the enemy believed impassable. When dawn came, the German artillery opened fire on empty fields, unleashing their fury into silence, while Allied soldiers marched unscathed toward an objective now undefended. Eleanor watched none of it directly. She remained confined within her narrow office, surrounded by whispers of calculations and the mechanical clicking of decoding machines. The only indication that her work had mattered came as a faint vibration in the walls when word arrived through the radio, confirmation that the enemy's strike had failed. For a brief moment, time stilled. She closed her eyes, feeling the tremor of relief pass through her like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. The men were alive. Her fold had reached them across continents, had stood between them and annihilation. But even in triumph, she knew better than to expect celebration. Her role would remain hidden, a secret within a secret. Others would take credit. The war demanded simplicity in its stories, not the nuance of a paper crease and a woman's intuition. Outside, winter had begun to gnaw at the earth, frosting the windows and silencing the countryside under layers of cold that mirrored the moral frost creeping across Europe. Villages burned, trains screamed through the night, carrying prisoners to places no code could reach. The air smelled of iron and despair, and yet, inside that dim outpost, the smallest flicker of human ingenuity pushed back against the abyss. Eleanor continued her work, refining the technique, using her fold as a prism through which new messages could be refracted, reinterpreted, undone. The soldiers she saved would never know her, but their movements, their survival, would forever trace back to the paper resting on her desk, a fragile testament to the power of imagination in the face of mechanized death. Weeks passed. New codes arrived, each more complex, more desperate as the Nazis scrambled to mask their vulnerability. They suspected a breach but couldn't locate its source. The arrogance that once shielded them now became their weakness. They searched for machines, for spies, for traitors in their ranks, never considering that their fortress had been penetrated by the gentlest of all weapons, a piece of folded paper. Eleanor smiled at the irony. War was built on the assumption that victory belonged to those with the largest guns, the loudest engines, the sharpest steel. But she had proven that sometimes victory belonged to silence, to patience, to the human mind, unwilling to surrender to the machinery of chaos. Still, the toll of secrecy grew heavy. Nights blurred into one another, her hands raw from constant work, her mind teetering between brilliance and exhaustion. She heard rumors of the saved battalion, men who now wrote home, their letters filled with cautious gratitude and confusion over how they'd been spared. Some credited luck, some divine providence. Eleanor, invisible behind the veil of classified files, read none of their words, but she imagined them, mud-caked faces lit by brief moments of laughter, boots scraping over stones that might have been graves had she not found the pattern when she did. She carried their unspoken thanks like a heartbeat inside her, but with every success came new demands. Command wanted faster results, more precision. They began to pressure her to replicate the fold's logic mechanically, to build a device that could perform the intuition she alone seemed capable. The request both thrilled and terrified her. To translate instinct into machine was to risk stripping it of its soul. Yet the war offered no room for hesitation. She sketched designs late into the night, experimenting with levers and mirrors, attempting to teach metal to think like paper. The more she tried, the more she realized that the magic of her discovery lay not in equations, but in imperfection, the slight asymmetry of the fold, the human error that allowed truth to surface where perfection concealed it. No machine could replicate that fragility. The snow deepened outside as Christmas approached, though no one spoke of it. The only gifts exchanged were messages intercepted and lives spared. Eleanor's reflection in the window looked older, more distant. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity, now carried the weight of every life she had touched unknowingly. But beneath the fatigue, something endured, a quiet fire, the same one that had guided her hand across the paper that night, months ago. She had seen how darkness could be broken by the smallest gesture, and she refused to stop searching for light. There are moments in war when silence carries more weight than the thunder of guns. For Eleanor Price, that silence came in the weeks after her discovery began altering the rhythm of Allied intelligence. Her method had become an unspoken doctrine among the cryptanalysts, referred to only as the fold, a term whispered with both reverence and disbelief. It was used cautiously, hidden even from those it protected, for secrecy had become both armor and curse. While the generals moved their markers across maps, while the soldiers fought and bled in snow-choked forests and blackened towns, Eleanor sat in the stillness of her narrow quarters, surrounded by crumpled sheets of paper that glimmered faintly in the candlelight like the aftermath of some strange snowfall made of thought. The war outside was loud, but her war, the invisible one, was fought in absolute quiet. The success of her method had created ripples across the intelligence networks of Europe. German intercepts now faltered, their patterns increasingly erratic, as Nazi cryptographers scrambled to fortify their communications. They had no idea where their walls had cracked. They searched their own systems like surgeons probing for an unseen wound, but the infection was not in their machines. It was in their certainty. Eleanor's fold exploited something more profound than mathematics. It preyed on human arrogance, on the belief that perfection was immune to imagination. She had turned fragility into a weapon, and with every intercepted message she decoded, the illusion of Nazi invulnerability began to crumble. One evening, a courier arrived from London. He carried with him a sealed envelope, stamped with the insignia of the Allied High Command. Inside was a letter, formal, perfunctory, thanking her for her technical contributions to the advancement of cipher analysis. There was no mention of her name in official reports, no acknowledgement of her precise discovery, no hint that she had, through her own intuition, prevented the annihilation of thousands. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time, the ink trembling slightly beneath her fingertips. Recognition was a luxury reserved for men whose hands were visible in the machinery of war. For women like her, victory existed in the shadows. Yet even in that shadow, Eleanor refused despair. She had learned that silence, too, could carry strength. She continued her work with renewed intensity, sensing that the tides of the war were shifting. The Allies were beginning to reclaim ground. Reports whispered of beaches taken back, cities liberated, air raids turning against their makers. Each success was built, in part, upon the foundations of unseen minds. People like Eleanor, who had never touched a rifle, yet had carved pathways through the chaos with nothing more than intellect and persistence. Still, she could not rest. Her instincts told her that the enemy, wounded but not broken, was preparing something desperate, something larger than any single message could reveal. Days later, her intuition proved right. A series of intercepted transmissions arrived, dense and irregular, their encryption far more complex than before. It was as if the Nazis had poured all their fear into these codes, sealing within them the last fragments of their dying strategy. For hours, Eleanor studied them, her mind running through sequences, variations, patterns, always returning to that same piece of paper, the original fold that had once opened a door no one believed existed. She folded again, tracing the new symbols through the old angle, and felt the echo of the same quiet revelation that had changed everything months ago. Beneath the confusion, there was repetition again, not in the letters themselves, but in the rhythm of the operator, a pattern of human error, small but persistent. She smiled faintly. Even machines could not escape the imperfection of those who operated them. She worked without pause, the candle burning low beside her. The messages slowly unraveled under her fingers until a terrible truth began to emerge. The transmissions were not ordinary orders. They were coordinates, schedules, and contingencies for the transport of prisoners across occupied Europe. Thousands of them. The Germans were retreating, but they were not leaving their victims behind. They were moving them fast, methodically, toward camps hidden deep in the forested heart of the Reich. It was no longer just a military operation. It was an effort to erase the evidence of their crimes. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read. Her discovery, for all its brilliance, had not prepared her for this kind of horror. Numbers turned to names in her mind: mothers, children, the old, the sick, people unseen but suddenly unbearably present. For the first time, she felt the crushing weight of knowing too much. She went to her commanding officer at once. He was a pragmatic man, worn thin by months of intelligence briefing, but even he faltered when she laid the decoded messages before him. Together, they read the list of transport, the cold precision of the times and dates. It was evidence of something far beyond strategy. It was proof of extermination. The room fell silent as the enormity of it settled in. There were decisions to make, moral and strategic, and none of them easy. They could not intercept the trains directly without revealing that the codes had been broken. To act openly would risk losing their advantage, perhaps prolonging the war. To do nothing would mean complicity in the silence that allowed such horrors to continue. Eleanor stood before the map, her heart pounding. The very fold that had saved 3,400 soldiers now placed her in front of an abyss no logic could navigate. Her discovery had given her power, but not control. She could save lives or keep the secret. She could act or obey. Her commander spoke quietly, his voice thin with the weight of impossible choice. "We can only win the war if we keep decoding." She understood, and yet she could not accept it. That night, as snow fell outside in pale, soundless flakes, Eleanor wept, not for herself, but for the people whose names she had read between the lines. She knew that victory, when it came, would be built upon ghosts. The days that followed unfolded with a suffocating quiet that seemed to echo endlessly in Eleanor Price's mind. The war had always been filled with sound: bombs, sirens, the staccato rhythm of typewriters. But now it was the absence of noise that tormented her. The silence of the decoded messages she was forbidden to act upon. The silence of trains she could not stop. The silence of people vanishing into nothingness, carried off by the cold machinery of the Reich. Each new message she decrypted confirmed what her conscience already screamed. This was no longer strategy. This was the systematic erasure of humanity. The weight of that truth pressed upon her like a living thing, something she could neither name nor escape. She began to wonder whether the intelligence war, with all its precision and secrecy, had trapped her in the same moral labyrinth as the enemy she sought to defeat. Her superiors ordered her to continue decoding. "Our mission is to end the war," her commanding officer had said, his voice tired, his eyes glassy with the erosion of empathy that comes from too much compromise. "If we act rashly now, if we reveal we've cracked their codes, we risk everything we've gained. We save no one in the long term." But those words did not quiet her heart. Every new sheet of intercepted transmission she received felt like a scream muffled by bureaucracy. Eleanor began working late into the night, not because she was ordered to, but because she could not stop. The paper that once brought her triumph now carried the unbearable weight of knowledge. Every fold felt like a prayer for those she could not reach. Sleep became a rare and unwelcome visitor. She dreamed of paper, folding endlessly, the creases bleeding into the faces of the people she imagined trapped inside the trains she could not divert. Sometimes she woke gasping, her palms streaked with graphite and tears, her candle long extinguished. She wrote letters she never sent, to her sister in Manchester, to the soldiers she had saved, to the nameless victims she now mourned. "I thought knowledge was light," she wrote once, her handwriting trembling. "But light only shows how deep the darkness goes." She tore the letter afterward, afraid even her confessions might be considered treason. Winter deepened. Outside, the world was turning to ash. Allied bombers filled the skies, pushing deeper into occupied territory. Victories were counted in ruins, liberation measured in charred stone. Eleanor watched it all unfold from the confines of her station, decoding the enemy's desperate attempts to maintain order amid collapse. She felt the shifting energy. Germany was breaking. The arrogance that had built their codes was now suffocating, but even in defeat, they remained efficient in cruelty. The trains continued. The camps swelled. Their messages grew shorter, colder, stripped of emotion, but thick with the implication of death. Eleanor realized that even as their empire crumbled, the Nazis were trying to erase their sins faster than the Allies could uncover them. And there she sat, between revelation and restraint, powerless in her own brilliance. Then came the message that broke her. It was shorter than most, almost banal in tone. A logistical update on prisoner transport, but buried in its numbers was a location she recognized, a small Polish village, once marked as insignificant, now transformed into a point of finality. The coordinates matched the area where her father's family had lived before the war. She had never known them, but suddenly they became vividly real to her. Faces in sepia photograph, the sound of accents she had never heard, the ghosts of ancestry calling her name through the smoke. The realization struck like lightning. Her fold, her work, had brought her close enough to glimpse the extinction of her own bloodline. For the first time, the abstract horror became personal. She could no longer bear to sit idle. That night, Eleanor made her choice. She slipped into the communications room after hours, her steps soundless on the cold floor. The hum of the machines filled the air, a chorus of mechanical breath. She placed a fresh sheet of paper before her and began to fold. It was not the precise, symmetrical fold that had cracked the enemy's codes. It was a new one, urgent and imperfect, a desperate experiment in defiance. Using her knowledge of the transmission systems, she crafted a forged message in the style of German logistics. It was a single directive, rerouting one of the trains scheduled to depart the following morning. The new destination led not toward the camps, but into a sector already under Allied surveillance. She knew it was a risk that could expose everything, but she no longer cared. Her conscience demanded action. Her trembling hands transmitted the message into the ether, her pulse echoing the clicks of the radio. When it was done, she stared at the machine as though it might answer her, then quietly returned to her room. The next day, chaos rippled through the outpost. Reports arrived of disrupted German communications, of confusion within their transport. It worked. Her forged message had been accepted as authentic. One of the trains had been diverted. Its contents, hundreds of prisoners, rescued after Allied forces intercepted the convoy near the border. The news was reported as a tactical victory, a lucky strike born of intelligence timing. No one suspected that the true cause was a woman with tired eyes and shaking hands who had chosen conscience over orders. Eleanor said nothing. She sat at her desk, her heart pounding, her secret alive and burning inside her. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe, but the risk had not gone unnoticed. Her superiors began investigating the irregularities in the intercepted transmission. The forged message had left traces. Eleanor's nights became filled not with guilt, but with fear. Still, she did not regret it. She knew the line between heroism and betrayal was thin, but sometimes the human soul must cross it to remain human at all. She continued her decoding work as if nothing had changed, her face calm, her heart forever altered. The storm arrived not from the sky, but through the corridors of the intelligence post. It came dressed in silence, carried by men with clipped voices and eyes trained to detect deceit. Eleanor Price had always known this moment would come, the day the whisper of rebellion met the machinery of authority, the day her conscience would become her crime. It began with a summons, an envelope stamped with the insignia of internal security, the kind of notice that drained the color from the faces of those who received. She opened it slowly, as one might unwrap a verdict. The letter was brief, polite, devastating. She was to report to London for debriefing on irregularities detected in cipher transmissions. She folded it once, precisely, as if to contain her fear within that single crease. The journey to London felt endless, the train cutting through a wounded countryside where villages smouldered and soldiers huddled at stations with eyes that had seen too much. She stared out the window at the blurred field and thought of the other train, the one she had rerouted, the one that had carried life instead of death. Somewhere out there, people were breathing, walking, perhaps even smiling because of her defiance. That thought sustained her as the grey skyline of London emerged through the fog, scarred by bombings, yet unbroken. When she arrived at the ministry, the halls were filled with the smell of paper and power. She was led into a small room lit by a single lamp, its harsh light flattening her into an outline of suspicion. The men questioning her were courteous, almost kind, but their politeness was a blade. They asked about the intercepted message, about her access, about anomalies in the transmission log. They knew, not everything, but enough to circle closer with each question. Eleanor answered calmly, her voice even, her mind rehearsing every fold and layer of deception she could summon. She spoke of fatigue, of possible misreads, of technical glitches that might explain the irregularities. They listened, nodding, taking notes, their pens scratching like insects against the paper. But she saw it in their eyes, the doubt, the faint shimmer of moral unease. Perhaps they suspected why she had done it. Perhaps they too had seen enough of the war to understand that sometimes duty demands disobedience. After hours of questioning, they dismissed her with a warning. "You're a valuable asset, Miss Price," one of them said, his tone heavy with unspoken meaning. "We can't afford errors." Not now. She left the building trembling, her heart both heavy and light. She was free for now, but she knew that freedom came at the mercy of a system that could crush her with a single stroke of a pen. Still, as she stepped into the rain-soaked street, she tilted her face upward and let the cold drops fall. She had done what was right. She had saved lives. No investigation could erase that truth. Back at her post, Eleanor resumed her work with a strange calmness. The fold, once a tool of discovery, had become her private confession. Every new sheet of paper she touched carried the memory of her rebellion. The war was entering its final act. The Allied advance had torn open the heart of the Reich, and from the wreckage came revelations that vindicated everything she had risked. Camps liberated, survivors found, horrors exposed in full, undeniable light. The truth that had haunted her in code now lay visible to the world. There was no longer any need for secrecy, and yet the cost of that truth would echo for the rest of her life. When the war ended, the outpost was disbanded. Eleanor was thanked, formally but distantly, and released from service with commendations that mentioned dedication but not bravery, precision but not mercy. History, she realized, was still written in the language of men. Her story would live only in the silence between official lines. She packed her papers into a single box and left the building for the last time. The streets outside were alive with celebration. People singing, kissing, dancing in the rubble of victory. But she did not join them. She walked alone, her hands in her coat pockets, her heart filled with ghosts. She had won the war that no one would ever know she fought. That night she returned home and unfolded the piece of paper that had begun it all. The crease was worn, faint, but still visible, a fragile scar of intellect and defiance. She smoothed it gently across her desk, tracing its edges with her fingertip. It was absurd, she thought, that something so small could carry so much weight. Yet within that fold lay the echo of 3,400 soldiers marching into life instead of death, of a train diverted from oblivion, of a conscience that refused silence. The world would forget her, but the paper would remember. Years passed, and the world rebuilt itself on the bones of what had been lost. Cities rose again, their ruins hidden beneath glass and progress, and the noise of peace replaced the thunder of war. But for Eleanor Price, the silence never ended. She carried it with her like a second heartbeat, soft, relentless, reminding her that even victory hums with the echoes of what it could not save. The government archives swallowed her work, sealing it under the weight of classification and time. Historians would write of generals and battles, of codes broken by great men in grand rooms, but the paperfold, the foolish, fragile thing that had bent the trajectory of thousands, was forgotten. She lived quietly on the outskirts of Oxford, teaching mathematics at a small school where no one knew her name had once trembled on the edge of war. Her students adored her calm voice, her odd patience, the way she turned equations into stories. Sometimes, when she caught them folding notes or paper airplanes, a flicker of bittersweet amusement crossed her face. They could not know that their small games carried the same motion that had once broken a machine designed to be unbreakable. At night, she sat by the window with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, watching the world outside move on. Newspapers filled with headlines about reconstruction, politics, the birth of a new atomic age. The wars of machines were giving way to wars of information, and she saw, with quiet dread, how easily humanity forgot the lessons it had bled to learn. Then, one evening, a letter arrived, unmarked, yellowed by time, written in a soldier's hand. Inside was a single paragraph from a man who had been among the 3,400 saved from the ambush years ago. He did not know her name. He only knew there had been someone, a woman, they said, whose work had cracked a code and saved their lives. "I have lived long enough to see my sons grow," he wrote. "If you ever read this, whoever you are, thank you." Eleanor read the letter again and again until the words blurred with tears. For the first time in years, she let herself cry freely. Not for guilt, not for secrecy, but for the simple recognition that her life's invisible act had not been lost entirely to silence. Somewhere, life had endured because she had dared to fold a piece of paper and believe it mattered. As the years bent toward age, she found herself drawn to the fold again. One afternoon, she took a blank page and repeated the motion with careful reverence. Her fingers, lined and trembling now, still remembered the rhythm perfectly. When the crease was made, she held it up to the light, and for an instant it glowed. A thin, luminous scar across white space. That was all history ever was, she thought. Light through a wound. She placed the folded paper into a small wooden box, along with the soldier's letter, sealing them together as one story, the unknown and the known. The act and its echo. Then she closed the lid and smiled. Outside, the sky had begun to darken with evening. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the. She stood, brushed the dust from her hands, and whispered a quiet farewell to the ghosts that had kept her company for so long. The war had taken much, but it had also proven that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, folded itself small, and waited to be found. When Eleanor Price passed away years later, the box was discovered among her things. Inside, the folded page was still intact, the crease faint but unbroken, a line of defiance surviving decades of time. No medals, no grand citation, just paper, memory, and silence. But for those who would one day read her story, it would be enough to know that the smallest act, the simplest gesture, can shift the weight of the world. If you felt Eleanor's story, her quiet courage, her impossible choice, leave a like, share it, and subscribe, because some stories deserve to be remembered, not for their glory, but for their humanity.